you. I can see, I haven't shifted mine to speaker view, so I can see at least a mosaic of you, many familiar faces, and it's really good to be here. I thank you, Marilyn, for this invitation to think with you about these important issues. And I come with some trepidation, worried that I actually won't fulfill the assignment, Marilyn, that you've given me. But I'm with you 100% in the conviction that we put God at the heart of the conversations that we might have around questions such as reopening physical spaces, or how we might respond to new guidelines that might be coming really any day or any week. And indeed, how we ought to be the communities that we are at this present time. And I affirm the premise that there are a wide range of images that the Bible uses for God, and that we might also draw from culture and experience as we, and that of these images, there will be some that resonate very deeply, and others we might be more uncomfortable with. But the relation between our confession, in this case of an image of God, and our practice is likely very complicated and probably not linear. You may be aware that within the many expressions of Christianity worldwide, there's an approach that asserts that God will protect people from infection. And therefore, to continue practices of communion, of singing, of gathering without masks, in fact, is an expression of faith. And to refrain from any of those practices might indicate a lack of faith. And this has been reported in churches from across the Christian landscape, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Evangelical. Does that approach follow from seeing God as protector? Well, maybe, but maybe not necessarily. There's certainly a lot of theological diversity and diverse views of God, I think, that might coalesce around some similar responses. Early in the pandemic, I followed discussions within US Catholicism about how public health shutdowns might reflect a fear of death, but that Christians ought to know that death is not the worst thing. This was how the argument went in some circles. Thus, an appropriately countercultural approach would be to resist shutdowns and continue celebrating the Eucharist, perhaps secretly, if defiantly. And a wide range of Christian groups have resisted shutdown orders as inappropriate curtailment of religious freedom, perhaps reflecting views of God as king, though perhaps for a variety of other complicated reasons. And even in the case of having a strong view of God as judge, for example, what one thinks God might be judging by means of a pandemic, or in terms of human responses to it, are going to be widely variable. In these cases, in all of these cases, I think there are a web of issues in play, including how a particular church views its place in the social and political order, and how it understands community and mission and many issues. We can see how different decision-making processes and thus ecclesiologies are at play in these cases as well. When I think about the history of theology, correlations between images of God and ethics have been difficult to identify. In the 4th century debates about the Trinity, and I promise I won't detour too much here, the link between an account of God and how Christians are called to act and how the church might be structured, and how to relate to the authority of the Roman emperor, for example, were not at all clear. Arguments from one particular image of God could support a wide variety of conclusions. And without going into the details and grossly oversimplifying, in the struggle between an Arian view of a hierarchy within God and a Nicene view of equality within God, it's not clear that these views of God map directly onto views of how Christians ought to think about hierarchy, or about whether the dominance of the emperor was a good thing, or whether Christianity ought to be in positions of political power. And maybe practice shapes confession. Maybe it's not only that confession might shape practice, maybe practice shapes confession. Maybe I have an inclination to take a particular approach to returning to physical gatherings for a variety of reasons. Some of them might be related to my personality, to a comment from a trusted colleague or a friend, or to a deep intuition. And these things shape how we might understand God in the picture. This could be a projection. That is to say, I could be imagining God or projecting an image of God that accommodates my desires. But it could also, I think, be something with more integrity than that. Perhaps as the Spirit leads in our actions and in our daily lives, we come to see God in ways that might reflect our embodied response to God. But just because I'm not sure that there's a correlation or a linear correlation, or if there is, in which direction it goes, that doesn't mean that I don't think our views of God don't matter. In the early days of this pandemic, I read many articles drawing parallels with plagues of the past centuries. These are the kind of things that came across social media and in other ways, often suggesting that the ways that the church responded in the past might be instructive for better or for worse. So for example, Martin Luther, who wrote an article on whether a Christian or a pastor might flee from a deadly plague, that article was dug out of the vault and recirculated for consideration. And I might be uncomfortable and want to shy away from some of Luther's conclusions that a plague might be a punishment for sin. We can also see in that essay that Luther has very concrete images of God, God as judge on the one hand, and God as fortress on the other. And during a different outbreak, during the bubonic plague pandemic of the 14th century in Europe, there was a noticeable shift in devotion to the resurrected and glorified Jesus, so from that emphasis, towards the suffering and the humanity of Jesus. And this shows up in art of the time, it shows up in the writings of and the visions of Julian of Norwich, that Jesus experiences the depth of our own suffering and comforts us as a mother comforts her children. But are these the images that we need? My own experience of this pandemic has not been of death all around me, at least not in my immediate experience, nor actually of much sickness. Now, others, of course, will have very different experiences. But this points, I think, to a prior question. What kind of crisis is this? What kind of crisis is this? And I'm not sure it's actually so clear. It's not like a horrific car accident that might kill 4 out of 5 family members. It's not like a natural disaster like a flood that happens and then we clean up. It's not like a hate-filled mass killing. It's not like the economic devastation of a major employer leaving a small town. And it's not, I don't mean to minimize any of those in the least, but I think in those cases, we have some collective experience to draw on in response. At the very least, in those cases, I think we can start by naming what is happening. And it seems to me that we are still unsure of what kind of crisis we're in, whether it's ending soon, what the new normal might be, what kinds of social or civilizational traumas will be its legacy. Is it a crisis of mass death? Is it a crisis of confidence in social and political norms? Is it a crisis of loneliness and isolation? Is it an economic crisis, increasing divisions of rich and poor? Is it a crisis for losing the capacity to physically touch one another? I think it might be a crisis of time and perception, and I think we can relate to the experiences perhaps of the first days of the pandemic when it was hard to imagine seeing more than a few days ahead at a time. And such closures might be coming again, but we don't know how it will be different because this time we think we might know what to expect, but we're not sure if we know. So what is the image of God that resonates when we can't fully name what is really happening? What is the image of God that resonates when we can't fully name what is really happening? So this is my attempt to reframe this question. And in the discussion that follows, you may want to take that question in a number of directions. Perhaps the image of God as creator of all that exists, as sustainer of that creation through all times, perhaps that's the necessary affirmation of faith. Or perhaps God as a mother hen gathering her chicks, or God as a rock, or a refuge, or a fortress, images that resonated for Luther. The Bible has many stories about the people of God being confused, misinterpreting the situation, fumbling in the darkness. And the richest collection of such reflection is perhaps in the Gospels, as those who encountered Jesus were trying to figure out and trying to name what was happening. That is to say, in a highly volatile religious and political situation and a disorienting experience of encountering a rabbi who seemed to be more than a prophet, Jesus comes eventually to be named as God. And so what does that mean for our image of God in the midst of a crisis we're still struggling to name? Of course, Jesus heals those who are literally blind. The risen Jesus appeared to strangers on the road to Emmaus. They couldn't recognize him when he gave a short sermon, but they did when he ate with them. And throughout the Gospel of Mark especially, the secret of Jesus' identity seems to be grasped by very few. So can we read the signs of the times? So I'm drawn here, as I bring my comments to a close, to the somewhat strange exchange that we find in Matthew 16, 1-4. And I'll read that short text here. This is about the signs of the times. The Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test Jesus, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." Then he left them and went away. Now, this might seem to make matters more confusing, especially since it seems that we shouldn't seek signs at all, and what the sign of Jonah might mean is enigmatic. And while I think we are warned against demanding a sign as a test, interpreting our context is important, though difficult, and is, I think, not being forbidden here. There isn't time to say much more about this text, except that I'm drawn to how Augustine and other early interpreters read the sign of Jonah here in light of another text in Matthew that links those 3 days of Jonah in the fish with the 3 days of Christ in the tomb. That is to say, in the call to interpret the signs of the times, to see which way the wind is blowing, Jesus responds in a way that turns the question on himself and points to his person. How might we see God in the midst of the pandemic through the lens of Jesus? Jesus brings us into the depth of human experience, including the experience of blindness, disorientation, and confusion, but just so, also into the presence and the very being of God. I don't think this is the end of discernment, but rather the foundation and its very beginning, and I hope it can be a point of departure for some further discussion.
All right. Oh, thank you, Jeremy. There's lots to ponder. Well, I think Jeremy has posed a number of questions for us. So I'm going to invite Kevin to send us off into breakout rooms for 20 minutes.